Best of luck with you again. Representative Jacobs, thank you.
Please welcome to the stage U.S. State Department Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Elizabeth Allen, and actor and United Nations Population Fund Goodwill Ambassador Ashley Judd, in conversation with Amelia Lester about diplomacy and advocacy for a just world.
State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Liz Allen.
Good morning.
Actor and activist Ashley Judd. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Pleasure.
You've both given me permission to use your first names, which is good because it means that we can get through more stuff. Ashley, let's start with you. And a fact I learned about you ahead of this event, which is that you live part of each year in the Central African rainforest at a bonobo research camp. And you say bonobos inspire you. Tell us why.
Okay, and what does that have to do with diplomacy? It has a lot to do. Well, first of all, as we know, Democratic Republic of Congo is a very challenging context, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to live there part of the year. I go to the east, I go to Kinshasa, where the research camp is. It's a 3-day trip from Kinshasa. It's very grueling and difficult to get to, and the folks are so poor. There's no minerals, there's nothing of interest to anybody, so there's no infrastructure, no NGO, no private sector, nothing. But bonobos, for those of you who don't know, they're not monkeys, they don't have tails, they're primates, and they are closest relatives. So when a bonobo looks at me, she's seeing a closer relative than when she looks at a gorilla. And bonobos are entirely free from male sexual coercion and male dominance. And they don't have a constitution.
Do they have a speaker?
The ranking female, because although it's an egalitarian species, a female is always the ranking individual. So she might be considered. And there's also the grandmother effect, because the grandmothers protect their sons. Yeah, and so and what undergirds their peaceful society is female coalitions. And all females help all females, whether or not they know each other, whether or not they like each other, which can be measured by grooming and sharing valuable resources and play, and whether or not they're related. We can learn a lot from bonobos. And who do we want to be? You know, chimps who are xenophobic, or bonobos who are xenophilic and love strangers?
I thought that was a great way to start our conversation here today about women and diplomacy. As a follow-up, Ashley, the Bonobo Research Camp is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course there's been ongoing violence there in the east ahead of a contentious election later this year. I don't know if you've had a chance to go this year or not, but what are some of the most pressing issues that you've seen facing women in this region? Because I don't think we hear a lot about them.
Right. So there are many conflicts in the world, and we acknowledge them all. You know, we're thinking about the disasters, the floods in Libya, the earthquakes in Afghanistan, the war still in Syria, the earthquake-affected people in Turkey, Venezuela, all of it, right? Nigeria. And in the East, to which I have been traveling since 2008, I've noticed, as one cannot help but notice, that it's really male sexual violence that drives so much of the instability. There's the exploitative mineral extraction from the multinationals, in which our government is still somewhat involved, but there's been some improvement because of the work of John Prendergast in terms of tracing that. But, you know, boys and men are recruited into these militias because they're hungry, you know, and it's like go live off the land where they can raid and pillage, which is they're given permission to do. And then they just rape women and girls and grandmothers. In the Luvungi rape some years ago, a grandmother said, "Get off me, you're my son." And, you know, thank God Dr. Denis Mukwege is running for president, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Panzi Hospital, who repairs vaginas.
Liz, can I bring you in here? Because you just took a recent trip in your role as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and that trip took in, I believe, Australia, Chile, Vanuatu, and Fiji. I was going to ask you about Vanuatu and Fiji and what you observed in those countries in terms of women's access to institutions and the economy, but you said something so interesting to me backstage about this, which is that what struck you about that trip was the commonalities in women across all regions, global south and more developed countries. Can you tell us a little bit about that observation?
I'd love to, and thanks for having me. This is a critical conversation always, but a critical conversation particularly when we're seeing women and girls continue to bear a disproportionate burden of humanitarian crises and conflict. And so I'm really grateful to be joined here today by everyone in the audience. It's nice to see familiar faces. I did just come off this 4-country trip, and going into the trip, and particularly representing the US State Department, I was ready to say, women and girls and women's rights are at the center of our policy agenda. That's true. It's not an afterthought. It's not a silo. It's a through line through everything we do. And to inform that policy, we should do a lot of listening. So I showed up ready to do a lot of listening in all of these places. Women, particularly in Vanuatu and Fiji, who don't see a lot of leaders in American government, were ready to talk. And I was so grateful to be able to provide them a platform. The power of being heard is a really good starting place to talk about solutions coming out of discussion. And to your point, I was very struck by the universality of experiences in the women in all these 4 countries. And I will say universality is not meant to take away from people's individual experiences, but I do think that there's so much power in realizing that we are not alone and that women are not alone in their experiences, and that in and of itself is such an empowering fact to move change. I will share with you one thing that really struck me in Vanuatu that I imagine many of you can relate to, which is the concept of a glass ledge, not just a glass ceiling. And women in Vanuatu were reflecting that, particularly dealing with anti-corruption issues, trying to increase transparency, trying to bring women's voices into civic participation, they were encountering a phenomenon in which women were being asked to run for office or put in leadership positions only to be set up explicitly to fail. And it was such a powerful thing to hear from someone to say, I've been advocating for more women candidates, I've been advocating for more women's leadership, and when we finally get buy-in, it's so performative. And we know that we might have only to go off the ledge because we actually are not set up to succeed in these structures. So I came off the trip in particular thinking a lot about both continuing the power of US convening role as the US government, and how we can think about structural solutions, particularly to this glass ledge issue.
Yeah, that's such a powerful concept, and one that I'm sure we can even apply here in the United States too. Ashley, thank you for acknowledging all these conflicts that are happening around the world right now. It's a horrible moment in so many parts of the world, but one thing that strikes me as a through line in your work as an activist and advocate is that you're thinking about women who are maybe not in the headlines and who are confronting issues that often don't get a lot of media coverage. You were telling me about an article that you've written about fistula and the difficulty that you had in placing that. Can you talk a little bit more about what happened there?
Sure. And women who are not really in the headlines, for example, are the pregnant women in Israel and Gaza. 55,000 pregnant women in Gaza, and I don't have the number in Israel. But that's tough to try to give birth. And they don't want to get pregnant right now. So do they have access to family planning? I think our reproductive and sexual health and rights, as was mentioned in the earlier, it's like the amino acid of the building block for our liberation and our participation in peace and stability. So I'm very fortunate to write op-eds based on my experiences, child labor recently, and then I wrote this op-ed about fistula, and I said, we care so much about mothers, or we say we do, but we don't care if their vaginas are ripped up during obstetric fistula or through male sexual violence, and how pervasive this problem is. And with early child and forced marriage, an adolescent girl's pelvis isn't adequately developed to deliver, she gets fistula. There's tremendous, and I've attended fistula surgeries in South Sudan and Congo. It's really wrenching. So I wrote this op-ed, and none of my friends would publish it. No one, I have a great editor at the New York Times with whom I did my privacy on suicide piece. They said, very laudatory of the writing, and they said, it's not for us. USA, no one. Scientific American is publishing it. It's the only place I could get it published.
Wow.
I look forward to amplifying it.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
I hope you bring a piece to us next time at Foreign Policy, because we would love to publish you on that and other issues.
I'm going to hold you to that. I love that. Thank you.
I have to ask, Ashley, how do you decide what issues to champion and to shine a spotlight on? You've traveled the world and you've seen so many challenges for women in so many different countries. It must be hard to decide which issue to focus on next.
Right. So when I was brought into this work in 2002 by Population Services International, lots of opportunities started to come my way. I called it crossing my desk. And what I decided and what I know about myself from my experience as having been molested by a man for the first time when I was 7, I was commercially sexually exploited for the summer when I was 14 in Japan. Gender equality is the hill on which I am willing to die. It is the up with which I will not put. And it's the striving for which my life has meaning and purpose and direction and belonging. And so everything must have at its core that girls and women and our liberation will be at stake in the work I agree to do. And I give an example. I was in the brothels in Madagascar, and women and I were sitting on the floor because they pay to rape them on the floor. And I was saying, how did you get here? And women are so trusting. It's such an honor to be trusted by women. It's like the great honor of my life. And some folks were saying, my dad prostituted me, or I was sexually abused as a child, or I dropped out of school when I got my period, and then, the teacher, because we had become a woman, and all of that. And this one woman, when it was her turn, she went, and she just meant same old, same old. All the stories, right? And it just boiled down to gender inequality at the household and the community level. And that's how she ended up prostituted in Madagascar. And so that's why it's just really the core of who I am.
And that, looking at things through that prism of championing women and girls and fighting their oppression, that must have been how you found the courage to be the first woman to speak up about Harvey Weinstein's abuses. Because that couldn't have been an easy decision to make.
Yeah, so first of all, I have to remember my mom, and I told her that I'd been asked to be, I had talked about Harvey and told the whole story in Variety magazine 2 years to the weekend before Jodi and Megan's piece was published, and no one paid attention. And because I was the sole subject of that interview, there was even more detail than was in the Times, but went without notice. And when Nick Kristof approached me, and I was like, this is so about Harvey, it's just time, I just knew. And then I spent a lot of time with Jodi, and my mom said, oh, honey, go get him.
Wow.
And I like to do the harder thing. I ask the higher thing of myself, and my job, it's like what it says in the Bhagavad Gita. I do the footwork, and I let go of the fruits of my labor.
I got chills when you recounted that. That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. Liz, while we're on the subject of getting messages out there, I've read about the US strategy to get Russians information about the reality of their war in Ukraine. It's so hard for everyday Russians to know what's happening. And the State Department has, I understand, a Russian language Telegram account. There have been direct appeals from President Biden, and you've been involved in this effort. Are you feeling hopeful that there are strategies coming about to counter mis and disinformation globally? This is something that's so relevant to women. Tell us some lessons you've learned about how we can maybe even apply those here at home.
Thank you for asking this question. It's our public diplomacy family at the State Department that is charged with leading the US government's work on countering mis and disinformation, foreign propaganda, and foreign malign influence in the information space. And to your question, what we are trying to do is really make this a structural issue, not a communications issue. I think for too long, this issue has been talked about in terms of social media content and content moderation, or identifying lies to counter them with truths. I think we all know that by the time you're doing that, you're already behind. It is a necessary but not sufficient part of countering disinformation to analyze and identify disinformation narratives. What we're really trying to do is put some structural arms around the fact that we have to work on the information ecosystem into which that content is coming. And we have to work to make the audiences receiving that information more resilient. So our agenda to promote free media and to invest in independent media to encourage investigative journalism is as important to countering disinformation as it is to call out falsehoods. Because the more truthful content we have circulating in the information ecosystem, the better off informed people are going to be. When we're thinking about internet freedom and digital freedom, an issue of our time, that's an issue where human rights and freedom of expression need to be at the center of that. And so I would offer to everyone that while we need to, if we think about the information space as a garden, as it were, we have to weed out the disinformation, but we also have to tend the garden. And that means making it a healthier information space. If you will, I'd love to just say one thing about what Ashley mentioned about sexual and reproductive health being at the center of so much of our women and girls work. I think what we all know to be true is that there is no women's security agenda without a women's economic agenda, without a women's health agenda. And we have certainly tried to tie those threads together in ways that create meaningful change. And I would offer that we in the US government, both the State Department and USAID, spend millions of dollars around the world on women and girls programs and policies. And we've learned a lot about how programs can be more effective. For example, our embassy in Eswatini conducted a sports diplomacy clinic for women in what is a pretty closed, repressive society for women to otherwise be able to participate or access health services. And a soccer clinic was meant to be confidence building, leadership building, build teamwork and camaraderie. And at that same soccer clinic event, we had health services present. Girls could go get glucose tests for diabetes. They could get pregnancy tests. They could go get information about sexual and reproductive health. We are trying to create environments that welcome women and girls in, where they can come in, be heard, be comfortable, and then use our programs in multiple ways.
And it strikes me in that discussion, that clinic and getting information, that information is a two-way street. Women and girls need access to that information, and then that information also needs to come from them as well. That idea of tending the garden and the power of investigative journalism, it requires people like Ashley to speak up as well. And I think there's a nice dovetailing there in that idea of information. Ashley, just sticking on that concept for a bit, social media has been so important for you in providing a platform for issues that, as we've discussed, don't often get a lot of attention in traditional media. Talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the power of social media to shine a light on marginalized communities or groups.
Thank you. So first of all, girls and women need to be safer online. And I did a TED Talk about misogynistic hate speech online because I've been the recipient of so much, for various reasons, like calling out a bad call at a Kentucky basketball game and, of course, my nasty woman speech at the Women's March. And so increasing that safety for girls and women online, and particularly journalists who are reporting, is really critical. And I try to use my social media in a way that appeals to a broad audience. And so there's some lifestyle stuff, there's who I am, my values, aspirations, and principles, my family, but it's really hardcore advocacy. I mean, that's really what I'm in the space for. And I have always been a little unsophisticated about it, and I just actually hired a social media manager because we did an audit of my followers, and they really care and are very passionate, but how do we catalyze them to be those activists in their own communities and to take action? So that's what we're hoping to do with that. And I think of the Arab Spring, and it was women. The men got the credit for that, but it was the women, and so much of it was on what we used to call Twitter.
Liz, I'm so curious as to, thank you, X, yes. I'm so curious as to whether you think social media is a net good for women and girls and for people who don't necessarily lead the traditional media outlets around the world. Is it a net good? What do you think?
Complicated panel question. I think that the information space, including social media, is only getting more complicated, more divided, and more polluted, and I don't see that trend changing. So I do think there are diminishing returns, but I don't think it's a reason to give up on the opportunity that social media provides. I think a lot of us think about whether or not we should participate in a certain forum, and as long as a forum is active enough with an audience worth engaging enough, our view is it's worth to be present, particularly when we think about US government accounts or US government voices. If we are not helping spread credible information, then who would, right, is how we think about it. And I think that is true for a lot of activists and leaders. As long as you're clear-eyed about the limitations of a platform, it is worth making sure that we are empowering people to tell their stories. And I think what we've seen all over the world as the information space gets more complicated is that it's citizen journalists, it's leaders telling their own stories, it's people finding out that their relatability is able to move policy decisions based on their personal experience that makes being present worth it. And I will just say, we're thinking similarly about AI. There are very real risks and very real detriments to AI in the information space, and we're certainly thinking about that. Everyone thinks about deepfakes and the spread of disinformation. But there are also some real democratizing opportunities that AI could provide, not just in the information space, but for example, to provide telehealth or access to educational materials. And so I think as with any issue or any forum, it's a balance of risks and opportunities, but I wouldn't expect social media to get healthier anytime soon.
Let's try and find our way to a positive ending to this morning. Ashley, what's one message or call to action that you'd like to leave the attendees here with today? And then I'll ask Undersecretary Allen for hers.
Take care of yourselves, because diplomacy is about it's about people, and it's very personal, and it's about relationships. And I really think that for me to show up for others, I have to show up for myself first, because I can't transmit what I don't have. And it's a little audacious to think I can be responsible to and for the betterment of others without knowing that my own internal housekeeping is in somewhat good order. And it's a tragedy if good folks like you burn out. So that's always a message that I like to carry. And then I think of the grassroots and the women at the HUD and the household level and the village and the water level as the hand holding the balloon, and the string is advocacy, and it's the tether up to diplomacy. And those connections and stories need to be really firmly intact. And like Polaris Project, for whom I serve as an ambassador of the Human Trafficking and Labor Trafficking Organization, they're not just survivor informed, they're survivor led. So let people really speak and know their stories, because that's going to inform the direction. And as we know, women's participation is a predictor of peace. And I would go so far as to say our peace is predicated on women's participation.
Secretary Allen.
I would offer maybe one of the things I find is my own North Star for finding peace and purpose against a lot of really intractable problems, which is the idea that incremental change is still change. I think we are all very consumed, understandably, by the magnitude of issues that need solving and problems in the world that need attention, and particularly on behalf of the many career diplomats at the State Department who spend their lives trying to tackle these issues. I think we all try to think about how to create change one person at a time, one community at a time, because I really do believe in the cumulative power of incremental change, and that helps sleep at night.
Yes.
Well, Undersecretary Allen, Ashley Judd, I think both of you should both sleep very well at night, because you've done so much to make life better for women and girls all around the world. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good to be with you. Peace be with you.